Peter Schiff Show.
Well, joining the program now is former Texas congressman, former presidential candidate, and the father of another potential presidential candidate, Dr. Ron Paul. Ron, welcome back to the Peter Schiff Show. Is Ron there?
Yeah, I'm here. Do you hear me now?
Yeah, now I do. Hey, well,
Okay.
Thanks for coming on. Thanks for coming on. I like, you are going to be the last guest on my show. I don't know if you know, but I'm after about 4 years, I'm going to stop this daily show and concentrate on other things. But I'm very glad to have you be the final guest on the show.
Well, very good. It's nice to be on your show.
Well, let's get started with foreign policy, because as bad as domestic policy is, I don't know if the foreign policy is even worse. It's kind of to see where we have a bigger disaster. But you were a big opponent of the Iraq war. And, I know it doesn't make you happy to say I told you so. But it seems now that the situation over there is probably worse than it was before we deposed Saddam. So what do we do now? I mean, do two wrongs make a right? Or what is your advice for President Obama? How do we approach the situation in Iraq with ISIS?
Yeah, well, I think we have to admit the truth. We've been involved. Republicans and Democrats have believed strongly that we should be involved in the world, especially after the downfall of the Soviet system, that we had a moral responsibility to spread American exceptionalism and be the policeman of the world. So it didn't take us long, and the Soviet system collapsed in 89, 90, and 91 is when we, got involved in Iraq and overthrowing somebody that we had worked with. Saddam Hussein used to be our buddy, especially when he was fighting Iran. So we get involved now. That's something like 24 years, and the conditions are much, much worse. Maybe the conclusion ought to be, well, it didn't work. So maybe if being involved and spending money and lives and making for a great deal of chaos and death and destruction in this country and the surrounding area, maybe we should say, well, it didn't work. So I would stick to my principle. We shouldn't have gone in, and we should come home as soon as possible and make a clean cut. Just come back, because our presence there just makes things much worse.
Not too long ago, too, we were talking about maybe bombing Iran. What are we going to do about Iran? Now we're trying to cozy up to Iran. We're trying to ally with Iran against ISIS and what's going on in Iraq. I mean, one day you're our friend, then you're our enemy. I mean, sometimes you're both at the same time.
Yeah, it's schizophrenic, if you can use that term to apply to our foreign policy. But you could apply that same argument to Assad. Assad, we tolerated and put up with it, but then, we decided, well, we have to get rid of Assad and draw lines in the sand. If he ever does this, we're going to do this. And we still have a position we want to get rid of Assad. But Assad stands up against these people. Now they're saying, well, maybe we ought to ally ourselves with Assad to get rid of ISIS. And, of course, we went in there trying to get rid of Assad and ended up giving weapons to ISIS. And we spend nearly $100 billion a year on intelligence gathering. But how many people talked about ISIS and what was coming, a month or so ago? Nobody ever heard of them. And all of a sudden, boom.
I know, and apparently they've been building for 4 years, and nobody said anything about them until it was too late. And probably, the worst part of it is, the ISIS is doing all this damage. They're taking over Iraq with our weapons, all the weapons that we left there after we pulled out of Iraq. If we didn't bring all those weapons, ISIS wouldn't have them.
It makes a pretty good argument for a non-intervention. I think they make our argument. If we believe that we shouldn't be there, all we have to do is look at it. But you know what they do? They cannot ever concede anything. What do you think John McCain will continue to say? He would say, well, you left too soon, you didn't kill enough people, we have to go back with more force, and 24 years is not enough. He'd probably go back to Vietnam for all we know.
Well, look, it's just like QE, right? It wasn't big enough. That's why it didn't work. We didn't do enough. We didn't print enough money. The budget deficits weren't big enough, and that is the problem. But what about the other foreign policy problem with Russia and the Ukraine? I mean, what do you make of the way Barack Obama is trying to bully Europe and confront Putin?
Well, I think it's more of the same. It's intervention when we shouldn't be involved. I think you said we'll talk a little bit more about foreign policy than economic, but I think it's real hard to separate them because so many of these so-called revolutions going on have an economic story to it, and Ukraine, I think it is too. I think they were bankrupt. They didn't know how to pay their bills, and half who speaks Russian said we should ally ourselves with Russia and get help from them. The other said Europe. But then once it looked like, once there was an election and they had Yanukovych, and he was sympathetic to Russia. So what did we do? We got involved. Once again, we don't like elections. We hate democracy, especially if they elect the wrong people. So we get to align ourselves with the European Union and NATO forces and go over there and have a coup and throw the guy out. And, and we may be there another 10 or 15 years for all we know, or it may escalate into something much worse.
We can't afford. We're going to have our financial crisis long before then. So even if we don't, pull out of these entanglements voluntarily, we're going to have no choice when we just can't afford it anymore because the world isn't going to finance it anymore. And so, I do want to get into economics, but I want to talk a little politics before I do. We still have the segment, but I know you came out and you're supporting your fellow Texan and your governor there, Rick Perry, even though he potentially is a political adversary for Rand if the two of them end up running for president in 2016. But, why are you defending Rick Perry?
Well, if you read the whole statement I made for this, it was he hasn't, claimed me as a defender because I said, I have a lot of disagreements with Perry. I don't like his foreign policy, and I certainly don't like his take on civil liberties. He's half decent on economic policy. But I think when it comes to this thing about him being indicted, for vetoing a bill for a program, the only problem with that is I think he came across too weak. He should have worked real hard to get rid of that program. Why is the state? Why do I have to help pay money to send to the county, Travis County, Austin, and subsidize these DAs that are Democratic election and the person that he had to run in with? So I just said that, the DA's, abusing the power a lot more than Perry is. So I just, threw that out for entertainment as much as anything.
Well, I agree with you. I think it's politically motivated, and, it's probably going to backfire. It might actually help Rick Perry, get some sympathy, make him into a fighter. I'm fighting the liberal Democrats. But talk about abuse of power. What about this, the IRS scandal? Why do you think the media isn't making a bigger deal out of this? In fact, I talked on this show just the other day about now the evidence has come out that not only were Lois Lerner's computers and her hard drive destroyed, but after that and during the investigations, when they came across her BlackBerry, they destroyed that too. They intentionally wiped out the data and destroyed the BlackBerry to get rid of all the evidence that the congressional investigation was trying to look at. I mean, how is that not abuse of power and obstruction of justice, and why is it not a bigger deal?
Well, I think government agents and the media are, one and the same. So they're not interested in principle if you talk about a principle of abuse of power and these things. That's no interest to them. So they look at it as political. Since the parties aren't different, why do they fight? Well, they fight over power and they fight over who gets the money first. But they all believe in welfare distribution. So I just think it's protect the Democrats. There's a big difference. One thing I noticed is I sort of enjoyed, and you understand the issue of a good, solid, honest progressive, because they'll look and we can talk to them. We can talk about civil liberties and foreign policy. And you take a guy like Dennis Kucinich. He remains my friend. We work together on foreign policy, but we just don't get into it about national health care. We know we disagree. But when it comes to some people, you take a Rachel Maddow. I mean, here she is. She loved having me on the program when Bush was doing horrible things on foreign policy, and I went along and said, "Well, this sounds good. I'm independent. Maybe she's independent." But as soon as Obama did it, I mean, she's still a Democrat first, and I think that's what's happening here with the IRS.
I've had that.
Because
Well, yeah, they used to have me. I used to go on CNN quite a bit when Bush was president because I was very critical. But once Obama became president, they really stopped having me on because they liked it when I criticized Bush, but they don't like it when I criticize Obama, in many cases for the same reasons, right?
Yeah, it's partisanship, and because they either don't know, understand, or care about the principle, but they may well realize that they're all interveners. Does the Republican Party represent a non-interventionist foreign policy of not getting involved in preemptive war? No.
Yeah.
Which party wants to go back to market interest rates?
And that's
neither party. They're all the same.
And that's what we got to talk about the Fed and Fed policy and the U.S. economy. And, interestingly enough, if your son were to run for president and win and nominate you to be the chairman of the Federal Reserve, would you take the job?
No, I wouldn't take the job. He's not going to do that, and it might not even be legal. I don't. You can't.
Well, you can nominate anyone.
You can put a relative into the cabinet, and that's probably a bigger position than the cabinet.
Well, what do you mean? Wasn't Bobby Kennedy, Jack Kennedy's Secretary of State?
They changed the law. They changed the law.
Oh, they did.
After that. Oh. Yeah. So you can't do that anymore.
Well, but even though you're confirmed, even though you get confirmed by Congress, you still can't, because the confirmations still have to be confirmed.
Yeah, but
right?
Okay, we'll put you in charge, and you do what's right. And
I'm not related.
What's the immediate effect? The immediate effect is that people would panic, and who knows what would happen. It would not be a smooth transition, so they'd throw you out in a week.
Well,
so it doesn't happen. What you said is correct. We won't clean up this mess until the whole thing comes down on our heads.
Well, we can't have a smooth transition. To go from the wrong monetary policies to the right one, it's like you're on the gas and we have to slam on the brake, because just easing up on the accelerator isn't going to stop us from going over the cliff. We've got to slam on the brakes, and so if we're going to do it right, it's going to be an abrupt change, and a lot of people who benefit from the status quo are not going to like it, but of course, it's the only thing that's going to work. And so we've got a break, and we'll talk a little bit more about the U.S. economy, where it's headed, because right now, all the hype, all the hysteria, stock market makes new highs, everybody thinks that the problems have been solved. Ben Bernanke was a hero. Janet Yellen is the heroine, a heroine who's, following in his footsteps. Everything is great. And of course, you and I know that that is not the true story. We'll talk about the real state of the U.S. economy and the Fed's responsibility in that after this break.
Peter Schiff is back on the air.
We're continuing our discussion with Dr. Ron Paul. And hey, Ron, I misspoke. I guess you didn't catch me either when I talked about Robert Kennedy. He was Secretary of State. He was the Attorney General of the United States under Jack Kennedy. So I just want to correct that. But, on economics, I spoke just earlier before you came on about this article I read in Bloomberg about falling fruits and vegetable prices in Italy. And the article said this is terrible. The ECB has to do something to stop these food prices from coming down. And they said the reason that they were coming down is because there was a lot of unemployment and people didn't have as much money. So I guess they couldn't afford to buy fresh fruits and vegetables. And so in order to continue selling, they had to reduce prices so people could afford to buy. And they're saying this is a problem and that we need more inflation so that food prices go up. And that's supposedly going to solve the economic problems in Italy. And we've got the same nonsense going on over here where they're all saying we need more inflation. The Fed's goal is to create inflation because we don't have enough.
Right. It's insanity. They hate poor people is what they do because, the free market and sound money helps the poor because prices go down. But it also reminds me of the story about what went on, during our Depression. That they believed the same thing. That's when they were really getting wild about Keynesianism. Prices have to go up, and that's when you have prosperity. So we're in a deep depression. Prices are dropping. There was true deflation, and they say, well, we have to have higher prices. How do you get higher prices? Well, you have a shortage of goods. So that's when the government told the farmers they had to plow their crops under. People are starving, and the farmers had to go out and plow their potatoes under and kill what they had because of this stupid idea. I one time asked Bob Bernanke about this, and he sort of deflected. He says, I didn't support that program, but he's a Keynesian, and they all do. They want prices to go up because they think that higher prices is a sign of a healthy economy. Well, then why wasn't Zimbabwe doing very well, last year?
And of course, consumers, look, everybody knows that what causes living standards to rise is abundance of things. The more stuff we produce, the higher our standard of living. And falling prices is a sign of abundance. It's a sign of plenty, that we have produced more, that we've reduced costs. I mean, this is a good thing. The lower things cost, the more we can afford to buy. Only in this crazy world of economics can you have an asinine view that that scarcity is good, that high prices are good, that pricing people out of the market. I mean, especially when it's food. How can these idiots argue that we need higher food prices? And, what about we need higher education prices? We need higher healthcare prices? Yeah. So, this is so crazy, but how is this thing going to end? This is, we have got to be nearing the inflection point where we have a dollar crisis. I mean, you've probably been warning about it longer than I have, but that day of reckoning can't be too far off.
No, it's coming, and one other place where they fail to recognize is that, even with inflation, productivity can increase in certain areas, and then they're reassured, well, there's no inflation, things are going well. In the Depression, the CPI wasn't going up, but there was still a lot of malinvestment, too much debt, and there still had to be a correction. But no, this is and there's a lot of people interested in an article I did the other day, on the value of the dollar and sanctions on Russia. I had more people hit on that article than I've had in a long time on anything. So there's a lot of intense interest on that. So I think people are getting very, very concerned. There's a vote coming up now in Switzerland to decide whether or not they should have, some use of gold in their monetary system again. And people, it's
Switzerland was Yes, Ron, Switzerland was, I think, the last country that officially severed any link between their currency and gold. And at the time, I think they were required to have maybe a 25% or 30%, I forget, gold backing. And this new initiative would require, I think, a 20% gold backing, which would require the government, the Central Bank of Switzerland, to buy a lot of gold because they have tremendous reserves now. They bought up all these euros in order to prevent the Swiss franc from rising, in order to deprive their own citizens of the benefits of falling prices. They created a lot of inflation so they could debase along with the Europeans, but now they have enormous reserves, and that means that if this thing passes, they have to buy a lot of gold.
And to me it's interesting because it seems like our opposition is winning the battle. The dollar is strong, relatively speaking, and gold is not soaring, and they've been able to convince the people the CPI isn't going up, and the markets are reflecting that. And yet there's an intense concern about the dollar and an intense concern about monetary reform, every bit as much, at least it's getting close to the way it was in 79 and 80 when we had interest rates of 21% and prices going up 15%. So it's sort of reversed, but they're still concerned about the right thing, and that is the currency itself. So I think it's a healthy concern that they have, but as far as when this thing is going to come unglued, it's going to come suddenly. It's going to come much faster than anybody believed because there's absolutely no foundation to the dollar. But right now it doesn't look like it'll be next week. But, if a hot war breaks out over Ukraine, that might be enough to topple everything over.
Yeah, look, there are a lot of things that can, start it. There are a lot of pins that could prick the bubble. But I do think that at some point and sometime soon that inflation is going to be intolerable for the vast majority of Americans. I mean, despite the government's claims that it doesn't exist or that it's a benevolent force that we should be glad that we haven't, people are going to start to really, there's going to be a backlash against this and against rising prices and inflation. And right now the government is, promising more inflation. And that's one promise, unfortunately, that they're going to keep. But I do think that a lot of the renewed awareness among a lot of people of money and inflation and the dollar is because of you, because of the things that you were able to do, the message that you were able to get out there, the following that you created in your presidential runs and in your term in office, and in your ability to help basically catapult your son Rand to the U.S. Senate and maybe even to the White House. So I really appreciate all the good work that you've done. I hope your son can carry out, and I thank you for being the last guest on the Peter Schiff Show.